have Ashley McGirt, longtime activist and a licensed mental health therapist in Washington State. She's pretty much everywhere, talking to everyone. Why? Because right now there's a lot of trauma going on. Thank you so much for joining us, Ashley.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and having this conversation.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm guessing as a therapist, you must be having so many conversations with a lot of people right now because of this uprising. And essentially, it's a lot of trauma, particularly for Black people. And can you talk a little bit about how the Black experience has been and why there's such a drive and need for therapy?
Yeah, it's actually been a huge need, not only because of the racial trauma, the protests, but just COVID. A lot of people have really been experiencing a lot of grief, a lot of anxiety and depression. And a lot of our normal coping skills that individuals utilize, they're not available anymore. Gyms are closed, beaches were shut down, parks. So the things that normally people would go to boost their mental health, it wasn't available. So now I'm seeing an increase in people really reaching out to mental health therapists like myself.
Oh, that's really great that they're getting the help they need. It's unfortunate that it's come to this point, but hey, as long as they're getting it, that's an important thing. And I know that we know Black people and brown people are being highly targeted for COVID-19. And also too, with this uprising going on and essentially it invigorating conversations about the legacy of slavery. Can you talk a little bit about post-traumatic slave syndrome?
Yeah, that's actually a term that was coined by Dr. Joy DeGruy. She actually wrote the book on it, done the research. I trained under her. She's one of my mentors, a really amazing person. But essentially what she looks at is how intergenerational trauma has been passed down from slavery and how there's a lot of behaviors that actually served us well as Black people during slavery. And now they're showing up and they're extremely harmful and hurtful. So her work really helps to undo that and to recognize some of those things. Like for instance, sometimes in Black families, or you'll hear things like, he's no good, my son is weak, just a lot of negative self-talk, which actually has a huge impact on the psyche of Black children. But when you break it down and you look at the history of that, it's because they're repeating what the slave master actually did. So in slavery, they would sell off your children, and Black mothers, as a protective factor, they would say things like, he's weak, he's not strong, because they didn't want their child sold off. But then slavery ended, and a lot of those behaviors are still passed down through our family, through our DNA. So a lot of my work is really around healing and repairing that collectively, especially throughout the Black community. And there's just a lot of hurts. We've never had any truth and reconciliation in this country when it comes to the hurts that we experience.
Wow, Ashley, that's really powerful. And it made me think a lot about kind of, my own upbringing and the experiences and the things we say and talk about. I had to have a conversation with a white friend the other day and explain that sometimes when Black people are seeming to put you down, it's actually lifting you up. Like conversations like, you bad, don't hurt anybody, that kind of stuff. But one of those things I think that really impacts the Black community are these barriers. And we have institutional barriers, we have economic barriers that keep Black people from getting the access of the mental health care that they need. What do you think needs to be done to remove some of those barriers?
Well, for one, there definitely needs to be more culturally competent clinicians available, and cost. We need to eliminate the cost for services. We need to make it accessible to all, because therapy is expensive. And a lot of therapists like myself, we don't take insurance because some of the negative ramifications that insurance has, a lot of the low reimbursement rate. So I've actually recently started a foundation to help provide free therapy to the Black community where I live, and also to support Black clinicians, future Black clinicians becoming one, because the education system is also very expensive. So it's just an expensive process overall. And what ends up happening is people who are poor or lower income get left out. And then there's a mistaken belief that therapy is for white people or therapy is for the wealthy. And that's not true. It needs to be available for everyone. So that's one of the main things, is addressing cost and access.
That's fantastic. And your foundation, I believe it's the Washington Therapy Foundation, is that correct?
Yes, Washington Therapy Fund Foundation.
Fantastic. And I know you have pretty much this wealth of experience because clearly you're very knowledgeable and you have an incredible skill set. And I understand that you've trained employees at Yale, Amazon, Lockheed Martin, and a number of other institutions. And now that there is this big push for essentially the white community to open their eyes so that they can have more open experiences to the experiences Black people have, what kind of change in the needs are you seeing from these institutions wanting your help?
Well, the big change is the fact that they're reaching out, because a couple months ago, I was reaching out to them and they actually didn't see a need for my services, but I'm treating a huge portion of their clients. I work in Seattle, so it's a huge tech industry, and the majority of my clients are with Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, all of these companies. And I'm like, I'm seeing a need. So now they're just now recognizing it, which I'm happy. And an interesting thing that's actually coming up in session with a number of my clients is a lot of anxiety around the skepticism that these companies are now, verbalizing that Black Lives Matter, but how are they actually going to show actionable items behind those words? And so these organizations who are reaching out to me, they're taking the first step in education, providing tips and skills and tools, and restructuring their organization and some of the policies that they have just around racism and white supremacy that is embedded into a lot of the work culture.
Wow. And that must be kind of demanding of your time, but also, your skill set. And I'm guessing, do you target pretty much, I guess, the white community differently than you do the Black community when you are giving these educational and learning experiences?
Well, there's things that I don't necessarily need to explain to the Black community when I'm having a conversation with them, just because there's concepts that aren't foreign to us. But things like systemic racism, police violence, those are now becoming everyday household terms, but they weren't foreign to Black people, at least to most Black people. We recognize what that is. So I don't have to do a lot of education when I'm talking specifically to the Black community. We get things. I actually just had a conversation today with a Black organization, and I'm like, I feel like we all need a hug from Big Mama right now. Whereas maybe to certain communities, I have to explain who Big Mama is, but they collectively already know who she is and what she represents.
Yeah, that is very true. And what would you say is kind of becoming one of the bigger hurdles when you really want to get through to white people, essentially?
The biggest thing, honestly, because I focus on racial trauma, and in order to understand racial trauma, you have to, one, understand racism and understand trauma. And I'm seeing that people get stuck on racism. They're running to Webster, so they're quoting me and going back and forth about what Webster actually says the definition of racism is, because people fail to recognize that racism is really discrimination, bigotry, plus power. And if you don't have that element of power, it's not really racist. I can hurt your feelings all day, but as a Black woman, I can't systemically oppress you. You're still gonna get a bank loan, you're still gonna get access to good education and healthcare. So it's really been getting people to recognize the power element behind racism and how these systemic issues impact our mental health and our psyche, and why it's important to have culturally responsive clinicians like myself doing this work. So that's been one of the biggest hurdles, people getting hung up on just the definition of racism.
And you say culturally responsive clinicians. Is there kind of a push in the mental health community for maybe particularly white therapists to learn this information so that they can actually be a part of these conversations and discussions, so it doesn't exclusively fall upon you? As I'd imagine, there aren't that many Black therapists as compared to the number of white therapists.
Unfortunately, no. And that's because we really have to understand the history of mental health, psychology, psychiatry. It's an inherently racist system that I'm working within. The APA, the American Psychological Association, just recently recognized not too long ago the impact that racism has on our mental health. So while I wish this was something that is being pushed, there are definitely a lot of white allies who are advocating for this. But overall, when you look at the founding board and who's in charge of the field of psychology and who makes the decisions, who helped write the DSM, these are not things that are being pushed. Dr. Joy DeGruy, who we mentioned her work with post-traumatic slave syndrome, she is not a household name, yet we all know Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, And he said that Black people were inferior to white. Sigmund Freud studied white Jewish women. So it's not something that is really advocated as a whole, but I would like to see it.
Wow, well, that is something I think we would all kind of like to see, especially myself, because hey, we all want to feel balanced and get the health and the care that we need. And thank you so much, Ashley, for joining me. Can you tell everybody where they can find you?
You can find me on Instagram at Therapy with Ash. Yeah.
All right.
AshleyMcGirt.com.
All right then, very cool. Thanks so much for joining us, Ashley. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.